recruits had been watching me for 2 days. I noticed the first morning, about 6 hours out of the Keth Doral transit corridor, when the younger ones started finding reasons to walk past the forward observation bay where they'd put me. They'd slow down, not stop, just slow, and take a look through the doorway, like they were checking on a piece of cargo that had started making noise. Then they'd keep moving. By the second day, they weren't bothering to pretend. They'd stand at the end of the corridor in clusters of 3 or 4 and look straight in, talking to each other in low Dralathi that the ship's translation unit caught maybe 60% of. I didn't mind. I'd been looked at before. I'd been looked at by species that had better reasons to be curious, and species that had better manners, and species that had significantly worse intentions. And I'd learned a long time ago that there was no productive response to being the interesting object in the room except to hold still and let it run its course. The observation bay on the Verithsorn was a functional space. The Dralathi don't do unnecessary, and their transport vessels don't carry it either. The forward bay had been assigned to me as a matter of courtesy. It had a long bench along the outer hull wall, a small table surface that folded out from a recess, and a wide viewport that looked out on the transit corridor in the direction of travel. The viewport was the reason I'd been spending most of my waking hours there. Deep space transit has a particular quality of light that I never got tired of. Even after 14 years of making it, those long, slow striations of ionized particulate and background radiation that you see when you're moving, fast enough that the universe smears slightly at the edges, like everything is remembering what it looked like a moment ago. Some people find it unsettling. I found it steady. I had a field-grade translation unit clipped to my collar. The Dralathi had provided it on boarding, standard protocol for Allied personnel without implanted translation hardware. And I had a data reader with 3 weeks of background, documentation on Dralathi military structure that the Debrief Commission had asked me to familiarize myself with before I arrived at KL DOS. I'd been working through it in segments. It was dense material, rigorously organized, and reading it gave me a useful context for the recruits watching me from the corridor. Because the Dralathi military education system is different enough from ours that it produced a different kind of young soldier than I was used to, working alongside. They weren't worse, they were differently shaped. The training emphasis was on doctrine retention and unit coordination, which produces soldiers who are very effective inside their framework and somewhat less flexible outside it. That's not a criticism. Every training system optimizes for something and pays a cost somewhere else. Theirs optimized for cohesion and predictability, which are worth a great deal in complex operations. What it meant for the recruits watching me was that they were watching something their framework didn't have a category for. And the fact that they didn't have a category for it was probably more interesting to them than whatever they expected to see. The Dralathi recruits were young. I'm not the best judge of that in a species where the physiological markers don't line up the way I'm used to. War Master 3rd, Gavin Saul, had told me on the first morning that this was a green cohort. First deployment rotation, hadn't seen anything yet. He said it the way a senior NCO says everything, which is like reporting weather conditions on a planet he doesn't plan to visit. Flat. Informational. Not asking for my opinion, I respected that. Saul had introduced himself during the boarding formalities. On a Dralathi, military transport involve a sequence of acknowledgements and credential verifications that take about 20 minutes and would take 10 if everyone stopped being thorough. He'd done it correctly and without impatience. And then he told me that the transit to KL DOS would take approximately 72 hours. That I had use of the forward observation bay and the secondary meal facility, and that if I required anything I should inform the crew, and they would address it if possible. He said all of this in standard, which was good standard. Better than a lot of Dralathi officers I'd worked with the specific kind of precision that comes from someone who learned a language analytically, rather than immersively, and cared enough to get it. Then he told me about the cohort. Green, first rotation, hadn't seen anything. He said it as information, not as apology or preamble. Took it as such. I'd eaten in the secondary meal facility both mornings, which was functional spaced. 2 long tables, a serving counter, equipment that looked like it had been designed for efficiency and cleaned for a long time. The food was Dralathi standard issue, which I could eat without difficulty, and which tasted like something between salted grain and mineral water. Not unpleasant. The recruits who came through during my meals kept a respectful distance that was also clearly a studied distance. They were aware of me and had been told to let me be, and they were following that instruction in the specific way young soldiers follow instructions. They're curious about the reason for. I ate and read the commission documentation and didn't give them anything to look at, which was the most courteous thing I could do. The ship itself was well run. You can tell on a military transport fairly quickly. It's not about cleanliness. Everything in the Dralathi fleet is clean. That's structural. It's in the design culture. It's about the particular quality of organized motion that a well-commanded ship has, where the crew moves through their work without the small inefficiencies that accumulate under uncertain leadership. The Varathorn had that quality. Whatever Saul's limit seems worse, running a ship wasn't one of them. The crew moved like they'd been doing this long enough that the work had become what the work is, which is the best condition a crew can be in. Saul himself was not young. He had the look that combat people get eventually, which is less about lines on the face and more about a certain quality of stillness in the eyes. Like everything that used to startle him had used up its quota. He moved through his ship the way career military people move through any space they spent enough time in, economically, without waste, with the specific kind of awareness that doesn't look like awareness from the outside. I recognized it because I'd been developing a version of it for 14 years. You stop spending energy on things that don't need energy spent on them, and you redirect that energy toward the things that do, and after long enough you do it without thinking about it, and someone watching you would say you looked calm. What you actually are is efficient. He'd spent most of those first 2 days ignoring me as thoroughly as his recruits were not ignoring me, which I also respected. He had a transport to run and a cohort to prepare, and I was a cooperative witness on my way to a debrief, not his problem. I saw him twice in the meal facility and once in the main corridor, and each time he acknowledged me with a nod that was exactly as much as the situation required and nothing more. It was not unfriendly. It was the nod of a man who has accounted for you in his operational picture and doesn't need to keep confirming your location. But on the evening of the second day, I was calling it evening by the ship's light cycle, which dimmed to a deep amber between 1800 and 2200. He came into the observation bay and sat down across from me without preamble and said, in very correct translated standard, that his soldiers had questions. I told him that was fine. He said they wanted to ask about Keth Oral Station. I said that was also fine. He looked at me for a moment with that flat quality his eyes had, and then he said that he wanted to make clear that this was voluntary on my part, that I was under no obligation, and that I could decline at any point without discourtesy. He said it exactly the way a Dralathi officer would say it. Formal, correct, the full statement. I got the impression he was genuinely concerned about protocol. It also occurred to me that he hadn't framed the offer in a way that made declining seem reasonable, which told me something about how he thought about information. He wanted the recruits to have this conversation. He was making sure it happened correctly, not making sure it happened at all. I told him I understood, and that I didn't intend to decline, and that he could bring the recruits whenever he wanted. He nodded once, stood, and left. About 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of boot equivalents in a corridor, more than I'd have expected, which meant word had traveled. And then the observation bay had about 30 young Dralathi soldiers arranged in whatever order hierarchy dictated, and Warmaster Third Saul standing to one side of the door, and they all looked at me, and I looked back at them. The youngest-looking one, a soldier I came to think of as the forward element, because he consistently ended up at the front of whatever group he was in, though I never learned his name, asked the first question. He asked it in Dralathi and the translation unit processed it into standard, which was what we'd agreed to use. He asked how many of us there had been. I told him 2. There was a pause. He asked how many of them there had been. I said I wasn't certain of the final number. I told him the initial manifest for Keth Oral Station showed 41 collective personnel, with a secondary garrison of about 20 Vethsora mercenary contractors when the incursion began. I told him those numbers had been substantially reduced by the time Corporal Yenadraz and I made entry, and that I couldn't give him an accurate post-action count because we didn't stop to do one. He processed that. He asked what I meant by substantially reduced. I told him that the joint element, 4 human operators total, working with 6 Dralathi reconnaissance specialists, had been working the station's exterior and primary access corridors for approximately 90 minutes before our entry, and that during that time, the garrison's capacity to respond in a coordinated manner had been significantly degraded. He asked what happened to the joint element after that. I told him they maintained the perimeter. He asked if they were destroyed. I told him no, that 3 of the 4 human operators and all 6 of the Dralathi recon specialists were alive at the end. 2 of the Dralathi specialists required medical attention. He nodded slowly at that, the way someone nods when they're not sure if the numbers are good or bad and want more context before deciding. A third recruit, smaller, standing near the bulkhead at the back of the group, asked how long the initial phase had taken. 90 minutes was what I'd said. She wanted the breakdown. I told her. Breach of the outer ring took about 12 minutes, which was longer than planned because one of the access junctions had been reinforced since the pre-mission survey. Corridor clearance on the primary level took another 31 minutes. Perimeter consolidation. Pulling everyone into defensible positions around the 3 main access routes took the remaining 47 minutes, the first phase. She asked if the joint element took casualties in the first phase. I told her 2 of the Dralathi recon specialists were wounded during the corridor clearance, 1 seriously. She asked what seriously meant. I said it meant she was not going to be ambulatory under her own power, and was going to need medical attention that the joint element couldn't provide on site. The recruits took that in. Someone toward the back asked about the station's defensive systems, whether the collective garrison had automated defensive positions, whether there had been drone support, whether the garrison had called for external reinforcement during the incursion. I answered all of those. Yes to automated positions, 3 of them, 2 of which had been disabled in the first 12 minutes by the Dralathi recon element whose specialty that was. No drone support. The station was a logistics hub, not a military installation, and the collective didn't garrison it like one. No external reinforcement call. We'd hit the communications array in the first 5 minutes, which was by design. The recruits who were taking notes, 2 of them had produced small field recording devices, wrote things down. The ones who weren't were listening with the focused stillness that I'd come to recognize as the Dralathi version of very careful attention. Another recruit, older looking than the forward element, standing toward the middle of the cluster, asked why Corporal Draz and I had made entry when the joint element was already working the problem from outside. It was a tactically sensible question. Told him that the entry was necessitated by the condition of Specialist Orev Wynn. He asked who Specialist Wynn was. I said she was the 3rd member of our 2-person element. He thought about that for a moment. He said that I had told them there were 2 of us. I said yes, he said, but there were 3. I said there had been 3. He asked what the difference was. I told him that Specialist Wynn had taken a penetrating wound to the upper chest approximately 11 minutes into the operation, during the initial breach of the station's secondary corridor, and that she had been unconscious and non-ambulatory since approximately the 16-minute mark, which was when Corporal Draz had dragged her into a sealed maintenance alcove on sublevel 2 and secured the hatch. The recruit worked through this, and then asked why she hadn't been extracted. I said that the extraction window had been at the 40-minute mark, which was when the joint element was going to break the perimeter and pull everyone out. I said that by the 40-minute mark the situation inside the station had developed in ways that made getting to the maintenance alcove difficult. He asked what I meant by difficult. I said I meant that the garrison, even substantially degraded, pushed a secondary response element into the station's interior corridors, and that those corridors ran between our position and the alcove where Wynn was. I said there were a lot of them in a small space, and that the alcove was on the other side of that. He said, so the extraction was blocked. I said yes. He said, so what happened to Specialist Win? I said that Corporal Draz and I went and got her. There was a pause that lasted longer than the others had. I watched the recruits process this. The forward element looked at the older recruit. The older recruit looked at War Master Saul, who was standing by the door with his arms at his sides, not contributing, not reacting. Saul looked back at the recruit, with the particular quality of attention that senior NCOs deploy when they want a subordinate to think through something without help. The older recruit looked back at me and said, "You went through the secondary response element." I said yes. He said, "There were how many of them?" I said I counted 11 in the main corridor. There were probably more staged behind them, but I didn't get an exact number because we didn't slow down enough to count. He said 2 of you went through 11. I said through and past, yes. Our objective was the alcove, not the corridor. He said, and I could hear him trying to find the tactical logic in it, sorting through it the way you sort through a problem you're sure has an answer you're just not seeing yet, he said. What was the tactical reasoning for that decision? I told him there wasn't one. He stopped. He said, there was no tactical reasoning. I said, not in the sense he meant, no. He said, then why did you do it? I said, because Yenna Win was in that alcove. He looked at me. I looked back. He said, she was already secured. She was in a sealed compartment, he said. The objective was to complete the primary mission and extract the operational element. I said yes. He said, Specialist Win was non-ambulatory and unconscious. She was not part of the operational element as constituted at that point. Leaving her in the secured alcove maintained the element's operational capacity and improved the extraction probability for the 2 remaining effective operators. I said that was all true. He said, so why did you go back in? I said I already told him why. He thought about this for a while. Around him, the other recruits were very still. I'd noticed that about the Drelathi. When they're working through something that doesn't resolve cleanly, they go still. Not frozen. Just very quiet, very inward, like they're running the numbers again in a back room somewhere. Another recruit, standing near the back beside a viewport, said, did you radio the Joint Element Commander before you made entry? Did you tell anyone what you were doing? I said yes. I told the Element Commander at the 40-minute mark that Draz and I were going back in for Win. She said that wasn't recommended. I acknowledged that and went anyway, he said. She didn't order you to stop, I said. She understood the conversation we were having. Ordering me to stop was an option. She chose not to exercise it. He said, why not? I said. You'd have to ask her. My read is that she understood that the order would have been wasted. It wouldn't have changed what happened. He thought about that, he said. She knew you were going regardless. I said yes, he said. And she let you go, I said. She maintained the perimeter and kept the extraction window open. That was the most useful thing she could do. She was a good element commander. He sat with that. The recruit beside him leaned over slightly and said something to him in Drelathi too fast for the unit to catch cleanly. I got the shape of it. Something about authorization, about command authority, about the gap between what was ordered and what happened. The first recruit answered him quietly, and the answer was short. Then they both looked back at me. He said, she was unconscious. She didn't know you were coming. I said, probably not. No, he said. She couldn't signal you. She couldn't coordinate with you. She added significant mass and handling difficulty to your extraction, and she increased your exposure time inside the station by however long it to reach the alcove and move her out. I said all of that was accurate, he said. And you weren't ordered to do it. I said no. The Joint Element Commander had recommended, very correctly, from a tactical standpoint, that Draz and I break for the extraction window with the rest of the element. The recommendation made sense. I didn't follow it. He said, you disobeyed a direct order. I said it was a recommendation, not a direct order. There's a distinction. He looked uncertain about that distinction. I told him that in our operational context, given the command structure and the circumstances, the decision was mine to make, and I made it. He asked what happened to the secondary response element in the corridor. I said they were no longer a problem after we came through. He asked what that meant. I said it meant they were no longer a problem. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what happened after you reached the alcove? I told him we got Win out of the alcove, and that Dras took her weight, and I worked the corridor ahead of them, and that we hit the extraction window with 4 minutes to spare. I told him Win was in a medical bay aboard the recovery vessel inside of 20 minutes, and that she was alive, and that she was alive now, and that she had been discharged from the medical facility on oral 9 days before I boarded the Vareth Sorn. I told him she walked out of the discharge under her own power. He took that in. I had the impression that part surprised him more than the rest, he said. So the operation succeeded, I said. We got everyone out. Whether it succeeded depends on what metrics you're applying, he said. What would you say the mission objective was, I said. We went in for a reason. We came out with everyone we went in with. That's the objective as I understood it. He looked at me for a long time after that. I could see him trying to fit the geometry of it into a shape he recognized, and I could see the shape not quite resolving. He had tactical training. He had doctrine. He had the framework that Dralathi military instruction gives to a line soldier for understanding how operational decisions get made, which is a good framework. I've read some of it. They let me look at portions during the transit, and it is rigorous, carefully developed, mathematically sound. It accounts for a lot of things. It accounts for asset value and exposure risk and mission priority weighting and command, authority gradient. It accounts for almost everything you'd need to account for. And it didn't have a category for what I was describing, was why his face looked the way it looked. War Master 3rd Saul spoke for the first time since those questions started. He said quietly to the older recruit, "You're asking the wrong question." The older recruit looked at him. He asked which question he should be asking. Saul looked at me. He said, "You went back in for a soldier who was unconscious. She didn't know you were there. She couldn't receive the risk you were taking on her behalf. She couldn't coordinate with you or reciprocate in any tactical sense. You took on significant additional exposure to extract a non-effective operator who hadn't asked for extraction and couldn't be aware of it." He paused. He said, "And you did this without hesitation." I thought about that. I said I'm not sure hesitation is the right word. I said we didn't stop moving long enough to hesitate, he said. "But you didn't consider not going." I said no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My question is this. Specialist Win survived. She walked out of the medical facility. She is alive. If she had not survived, if you had reached the alcove and she had already died of her wound, would you still have gone in for her?" Looked at him. I said yes. I said we would have gone in for her anyway. He said, "Knowing she might already be dead." I said, "Not knowing either way." "When you don't know you go," he said. "And if she had been dead when you arrived," I said, "then we would have brought her out." He was very still. The recruits were very still. The forward element, who had asked the first question a long time ago and hadn't asked another since, was looking at me with an expression that I thought was probably the closest a young Dralathi soldier could get to what a human would call having the floor drop out from under you. The older recruit had stopped trying to find the tactical logic. I could see that in his face. He'd stopped sorting through the framework and the variables and the probability weighting, and he was just looking at me, very quietly. Saul said, "You would have gone in knowing you might die, to bring out a soldier who was already dead," I said. "You don't let them stay there," he said. "Why not?" And that was the right question. That was the one I'd been waiting for. Not because I had a clever answer. I didn't. But because it was the first question in the whole conversation that ended asking the right thing. All the other questions had been asking about tactical reasoning, about probability assessments, about command structures and mission objectives and operational logic. This one was asking about something else. And because it was asking about something else, it was going to get a different kind of answer, I said. "Because she's ours." He looked at me. He said, "Explain that." I said I didn't know how to explain it past that exactly. I said I'd try. I said, "Yenna Win joined our element 3 weeks before Ketharel. I'd known her for 22 days when she took that wound. We'd done 2 training iterations together, and 1 low-intensity insertion that didn't develop into anything meaningful. I knew that she took her coffee without anything in it, and that she had a habit of checking her kit in a specific order, left to right, every time, always the same sequence, and that she was better in tight corridors than open spaces, tactically speaking, and that, She had a younger brother somewhere who worked on fishing vessels, which I knew, because she'd mentioned it once. That's what I knew about her. 3 weeks, and I said, it didn't matter. When she went down, she became ours, not a responsibility, not an asset, not a tactical consideration. Ours. And you don't leave yours in a maintenance alcove on sub-level 2 of a collective-controlled station. You don't file a report that says asset was non-extractable and move on. That isn't a calculation we do, he said, but why not? He said it, the ultimate challenge. He said it the way someone asks why not when they genuinely want to understand the underlying axiom. Not when they're disputing the conclusion, I said, because if you leave her there, then every person who works with you, every person who has ever put themselves next to you in a corridor and trusted that you would do the same for them, has just learned something about what they're worth to you. They've learned that the value of their life is conditional, that there's a threshold of difficulty above which you will stop trying to bring them home. And if they know that, if that becomes the understanding, then the element doesn't work the way it needs to work. He waited. I said, person who knows they'll be left alone, left in the dark, left without anyone coming. That person fights differently than a person who knows they won't be. And the way you fight differently is this. You start measuring your exposure. You start calculating what's worth doing and what isn't. You start keeping a small reserve of yourself that you don't fully commit because you've learned that full commitment isn't matched. You fight well. You might even fight better in certain technical respects, if you're fighting efficiently. But you're not fighting the way we fight, which is all the way, no reserve, because you know we'll come back for you, he said. And that matters, I said. It's the whole thing. It's all of it, he said. Describing a conditional. You don't leave anyone, and therefore your people fight without holding back, and therefore your element is more effective than the math says it should be. I said, no, said. And this was the part I was least confident I could explain to his satisfaction. I said it's not a conditional. It's not a trade. We don't go back because going back makes the element more effective. We go back because she's ours, and that's not negotiable, and the effectiveness is a consequence of that, not the reason for it. If you do it for the effectiveness, it doesn't work the same way. People on your element can tell. He was quiet for a long time. I waited. Outside the observation bay windows, the transit corridor had the deep banded light that deep space transit always has, those long, slow striations of dust and radiation that you see when you're moving fast enough that the universe smears slightly. It's not something I got tired of looking at. I'd spent a lot of hours in transit looking out at that light, and I had the impression that this was going to be one of those hours, because nobody in the bay seemed inclined to move. The forward element, the youngest-looking one, who'd asked the first question, said quietly, "What happened to the secondary response element?" He said it carefully. Not the way someone asks a tactical question. The way someone who has been knitting with something for a while finally says it out loud. I said, "They were between us and Wynn." He said, "Yes, but what happened to them?" I said, "What do you think happened to them?" He thought about that for a moment. He said, "You said 2 went through 11 and came back with Wynn and made the extraction window." I said, "Yes," he said. "And the 11 didn't stop you." I said, "No." He said, "Was it because you were better trained? Were you faster or more capable? In technical sense that the secondary element couldn't match?" I said we were probably better trained, yes. I said there's a real gap in certain technical respects, and I wasn't going to pretend there wasn't. He said, "But that's not why." I said, "Not entirely." "No," he said. "Then why?" I said, "Because they were between us and Wynn, and we were going to get Wynn. And the secondary element was the part of that problem that needed to be solved. And so we solved it. There wasn't anything complicated about it. It wasn't rage and it wasn't strategy. We needed to be on the other side of them, and they were in the way," he said. "You weren't afraid of them." I said, "I don't know that afraid is the right word. I knew what they could do, and I knew what being on the wrong end of it looked like. We were already going. It's difficult to explain. The decision was made. Everything after the decision is just execution," he said. "The decision to go back for her." I said, "Yes," he said. "So once you decided to go, there was nothing in the corridor that was going to change the outcome." I said, "Nothing in that corridor was going to change whether we tried. The outcome was something else's business. He sat with that. The whole bay sat with it. I had the impression that the Dralathi process things collectively in some functional sense. Not that they're a hive. Nothing like that. They're very individually distinct. But that when one of them is working something through, the ones around them go quiet in a particular way, like they're clearing space. The forward element had everyone's attention. He was the youngest one in the room, and he'd asked a question that the older recruits hadn't asked, and Saul was watching him the way Sisal watched, things that interested him. The young soldier said, "I don't think I have a category for that." I said, "No, I don't think you're supposed to," he said. Went into a contested corridor with 11 armed hostiles because someone you'd known for 3 weeks was unconscious on the other side of them, and you couldn't have known whether she was alive. And you were going anyway. "And you're telling me it wasn't rage," I said. "It wasn't rage. Rage would have slowed us down," he said. "Then, what was it?" I thought about that for a moment, because it deserved a careful answer and not a fast one. I've been asked versions of this question before, usually by people trying to find the tactical doctrine inside it, the thing they can write down and teach and replicate. And the reason they don't find it is that it isn't a doctrine. It isn't a technique. It isn't a chapter in a manual or a module in a training program. You can describe it from the outside. You can describe its effects. You can describe what a unit looks like when it has it versus when it doesn't. But the thing itself isn't a doctrine, I said. It's simpler than you're making it. When someone is yours, you go. That's it. You don't calculate it, and you don't weigh it, and you don't check whether it's tactically optimal. She was ours, and she was there, and we went. The corridor was the corridor. You deal with the corridor, he said. And the fact that you might have died, I said. Yes, he said. That was also just part of it. I said, it's always part of it. If you can't accept that part, you're in the wrong line of work, he said. You went anyway, I said. We always go anyway, that's what we are. He was very still. Saul was watching him. Saul was watching me. Outside, the long, slow light of transit moved in its bands and striations. Somewhere deeper in the ship, I could hear the low operational sounds of a working transport. The cycle of environmental systems, the faint harmonic of the drive array. Sounds that are the same on every ship, in every fleet, because physics is physics and the solutions converge. There's something I've always found steady about those sounds. The world doing what it does. Saul said, after a while. I've been in this work for a long time. He didn't address that to anyone. He said it to the room. He said, I've read engagement reports from every major species that has had contact with human operational elements. Dralathi command analysis. Collective tactical assessments. Vethsora mercenary after-action briefings. The summary that the Interspecies Military Accord Commission published 2 years ago. I've read them all, he said. They all try to find the tactical principle. They treat it as a doctrine that can be understood, and therefore countered. They assume that the behavior follows from a decision tree, and that if you can map the decision tree, you can predict the behavior, and if you can predict the behavior, you can account for it. He paused. He said, they're all wrong about what it is. I didn't say anything, he said. It isn't a decision tree. You don't decide to go back. You go back because not going back isn't a thing you do. And no one ever made a decision that a thing they don't do is something they don't do. You simply don't do it. He looked at me. He said, problem. And I want you to understand that I'm using that word technically as a military analysis problem. The problem is that you cannot model an element that has no floor. Every other force structure we have doctrine for has a floor, a threshold below which the asset will not descend. Resources it will not expend. Exposure it will not accept. You use that floor. You find it, you press against it, you structure your approach to it. That's how you fight anyone. It's how fighting works, he said. You don't have a floor, I said. Not when it's one of ours. No, he said. And we can't put one in, I said. No, he said. So we can't model what you'll do, because what you'll do has no lower bound on cost. I said. That's about right, he said. And your people fight without a reserve, because there's no need for one, because they know you'll come. I said, yes, he said. And that makes you. And he paused here, not for effect, but because he was picking his words carefully, he said. It makes you very difficult to plan against. I said, I've heard that, he said. Every force this commission has studied has at some point in an engagement made a calculation. This objective isn't worth this cost. Every force, without exception. The cost-benefit floor. The moment where the math says stop, he said. You reach that moment and you keep going, I said. We reach that moment, and we go back in for whoever's on the other side of it. He looked at me for a long time. The recruits were all watching him now. The way recruits watch a senior NCO. When he's working through something, in front of them, and they understand they're being shown something, even if they're not sure yet what it is. The older recruit spoke again. He said, War Master, is this documented? He meant in the Accord Commission's analysis in the Dralathi Military Review. Saul said it was noted. He said noted, not documented. And the older recruit caught the distinction and didn't push it. Noted meant someone had observed it. Documented meant someone had built doctrine around it. Those are different stages and they're different kinds of knowledge. Saul said, I'm going to write this down. I said, all right. He said, I've been trying to find a way to write this down accurately for a long time. I've read everyone else's attempt. They all center it on the wrong thing. They say, humans are effective because of their physical tolerances, or their improvisation, or their technical capability. And those things are true. But that isn't the thing. He said the thing is this. You go back. You always go back. And every person in your element knows you'll go back. And because they know that, they don't hold anything in reserve. And because they don't hold anything in reserve, they do things that a force with a floor cannot do. The capability isn't the source. The reason you go back is the source. And the reason you go back isn't doctrine and it isn't tactics. It's that they're yours. He said that last part slowly, like he was testing the weight of it, like he was seeing if it would hold under examination. He said, and there's no counter-doctrine for that. Because you can't train a counter-doctrine for a motivation that isn't rational, in the sense that it isn't subject to cost-benefit analysis. You counter cost-benefit analysis by changing the costs or the benefits. You can't change the costs or the benefits of something that isn't a cost-benefit calculation. It's not that the calculation comes out differently. There is no calculation, I said. That's right, he said. Because she's yours, I said. She's ours. He was quiet for a while. The forward element was very still. The older recruit was looking at the floor, in a way that made me think he'd stopped searching for the tactical logic, and found something else there. Instead, something he wasn't going to be able to unfind. The small recruit at the back, the one who'd asked about the timeline breakdown early on, said something in Dralathi that the unit caught as, then, how do you fight them? She said it quietly, not to me, more like she was thinking aloud. Saul heard it. He looked at her and said, in Dralathi, and slowly enough that I caught it, that is the correct question. He didn't answer it. He let it sit. I said, you fight us the same way you'd fight anyone. You just have to go in knowing there's a category of decision we're going to make that won't follow the model, and knowing that in advance is worth something. It's worth more than not knowing. She looked at me. She said, it doesn't change the outcome. I said, not much, no. She sat with that. Saul reached into the carry bag he had over his shoulder and produced a small recording device. Flat, dark, the shape that field documentation equipment always tends toward, functional before elegant, and he set it on the surface between us. He said, I'd like to record the rest of this conversation with your permission. I said, that was fine, he said. I want to ask one more question. I said, go ahead, he said. The 11 in the corridor. When you came through them, what were you thinking? I said. I was thinking about the alcove hatch, he said. Not about them, I said. They were the problem between me and the hatch. You think about the problem when you're dealing with the problem. Then you think about the next thing, he said. And after the hatch, when you had Win. I said I was thinking about the extraction window. 4 minutes. I was thinking about the route back, about where Dras had her, about whether she needed anything intermediate before we moved. I was thinking about the corridor we'd just come through and how it looked now. I was thinking about a lot of things, he said. You thinking about her? I thought about that. I said yes and no. She was the reason we were there, and the reason was no longer. The reason had become the mission. She was ours and we had her, so in one sense, yes. In another sense, I was thinking about getting her to the extraction window, which is a different kind of thinking. He said, when you saw her in the alcove, what was that like? I said. She was in bad shape. The wound had been bleeding for a while, and she'd been in there for over an hour. She was unconscious. She was cold. She didn't look good. Assessed her fast and said she was still viable, and we moved, he said. And that was enough, I said. More than enough. We had her. We moved. He said, you didn't. He paused. You didn't feel anything. I said, I didn't say that. He looked at me. I said we moved. Moving and feeling aren't the same category, he said. What did you feel? I was quiet for a moment. I said, I felt like she'd better still be alive at the extraction window. And that was going to be accomplished by moving and not by feeling things while we stood there, so we moved. The feeling was a motivational fact, not a reason to slow down, he said. The feeling being, I said. She was ours and she was alive and we had her. That was the feeling, he said. Relief, I said. Something more like. Relief implies there was doubt before. I'm not sure there was doubt exactly. There was a situation that needed to be resolved, and it was being resolved. The feeling was more like rightness. The thing that needed to be true was becoming true. We were making it true, he said, because she's yours. Yes. He reached forward and pressed something on the recording device, and it went silent. He said, I think I have what I need. He said it in Dralathi, which the translation unit caught converted. And then there was a slight delay, where I think he realized he'd switched languages, and he said it, again in standard, more deliberately. I told him I was glad. He nodded. He told the recruits then, in Dralathi, without translating, so I got maybe half of it through the unit. He told them something. I caught pieces. The word for threshold, the word for doctrine, the phrase that translates roughly as without floor, without ceiling. The phrase that I'd learned meant something like, pay attention, this is the thing. The recruits were very quiet. The forward element was looking at me with an expression I'd started to understand better over the past few hours. Not fear, not quite awe, something more like the specific weight a young soldier gets when they've understood something that they're going to have to live with from now on. Something that changes the shape of the work in a way that doesn't change back. Saul stood. He thanked me for my time in the formal Dralathi way that involves both hands at a specific position and a slight inclination of the head, and I thanked him back in the human way, which is to stand and extend a hand, which I did. And he looked at my hand for a moment and then shook it, which I appreciated. The recruits filed out in their cohort order, quiet, no clustering in the doorway the way they'd clustered the first 2 days. Different kind of quiet now. The forward element was the last one out. He paused in the doorway for a moment and looked back at me, and I thought he was going to ask something. His mouth moved slightly, then he didn't. He turned and went. I sat back down. Transit corridor outside the observation bay window was doing what it always does. Those long banded striations of deep space light moving in, their slow way past the port, the universe going by at the speed you need it to go by. I watched it for a while. Sure. There's some things I didn't say to Saul because he didn't ask, and because it would have taken longer to explain than the conversation had left in it. He was right that there's no counter-doctrine for it. He was right that it isn't a cost-benefit calculation, and therefore can't be countered by manipulating costs or benefits. All of that was accurate analysis. But the piece that I didn't say, piece that I've thought about in the years since Kethoral, and in the months before it, and in all the operations that have the same quality of problem at their center is this. It isn't a tactical advantage in the sense that Saul was framing it, and it isn't something we cultivated to achieve that advantage. And it isn't even, when you get to the bottom of it, a military virtue at all. It's just the way we are. It came first. The effectiveness came after. And the distinction matters, because a thing that you cultivate for an advantage is a thing that can be abandoned when the advantage calculation changes. A thing that came first, that is in some functional sense prior to the calculation, cannot be abandoned in that way. There's no mechanism for it. We go back. We have always gone back. In circumstances where going back was operationally unjustifiable, tactically catastrophic, mathematically absurd, we go back anyway. We go back for the ones we knew for 22 days and the ones we knew for 22 years, and we go back in exactly the same way for both of them. With the same quality of certainty that doesn't feel like certainty so much as it feels like gravity, like the direction things fall. I've talked to other operators about this over the years, in the particular kind of conversation that happens after operations, when the adrenaline has cleared and people are honest. No one has ever described calculating it. No one has ever described a moment where they weighed the cost and decided to pay it. They describe a moment where the decision was already made and they were catching up to it. They describe the corridor as a fact that needed to be dealt with. They describe the person in the alcove as the only relevant information. That's the whole of it, at the bottom. I thought about the young forward element, standing in the doorway with something new, working its way into his understanding. He'd come to this transport as a line soldier, with good training and sound doctrine, and he'd sit at Kale Doss with the same training and the same doctrine, and neither of those things had changed. What had changed was this. He now knew that there was a kind of operational element that had no floor, that would come through a corridor for one unconscious person who didn't know anyone was coming, that would do it without hesitation and without rage, and without any of the emotional markers that doctrine would tell you to look for as signs of irrational risk-taking. He knew it was a thing that existed. That knowledge was going to live somewhere in his framework now, in a place where there wasn't a category for it, and it was going to stay there. I've been thinking, since Kethorel, about what it would take to explain this to someone who wasn't raised inside it. Not to justify it, not to argue for its military utility, just to explain it the way you'd explain any fact that is prior to argument. The sky is a certain color for a certain physical reason. Humans go back. The reason is the same order of fact. It isn't a policy. It isn't a choice we make each time and ratify. It is the thing we are, and the things we do follow from it, the way weather follows from atmospheric conditions. Reliably, without deliberation, according to pressures that were already there, before anyone started watching. Will file its report, and it will be accurate on the facts and incomplete on the meaning, which is the condition of all accurate reports about things that don't translate cleanly into reportable units. That's not a criticism of the Commission. They're doing what reports do, which is establish the facts at a level of specificity that can be transmitted, verified, and cross-referenced. The fact that Draz and I went back through 11 armed hostiles for one unconscious specialist, that's a fact. The fact that we made the window, that's a fact. The fact that Wynne walked out of the facility on her own, that's a fact. Those facts will be in the report, and they should be. What won't be in the report, or will be in it badly, is the reason those facts are what they are, which is not a tactical reason, and not a strategic reason, and not a doctrine reason. It's an older reason. It's the reason a person runs into a burning building for someone who might already be dead. It's the reason a sailor goes over the side in bad water for a shipmate who's gone under. It's the reason none of those decisions feel, in the moment, decisions at all. They feel like facts. They feel like the only thing that is going to happen next, because the alternative is not a thing that is in the set of things that happen. Yenawin was in a maintenance alcove on sublevel 2 of Kethorel Station, and and we went and got her. That's the whole story. I sat in the observation bay for another few hours after Saul, and the recruits left, watching the light of transit move. Around 2100 by the ship's cycle, one of the crew came by to ask if I needed anything, and I said no, I was fine, and I think she was a she, had gotten better at reading Drelotha physiology, but not reliable. She nodded and left me to it. We made debrief station Kale Doss the next morning. I went through the station's intake process, which involved about 4 hours of formal Q&A with a Drelotha Accord Commission representative and a human debrief officer, during which I told them most of what I've told here in a more official register, and with more specific tactical data, and filed it and thanked me for my cooperation. The Commission representative said that my account would be incorporated into the ongoing study of joint operational parameters. I said that was fine. I learned, about a week later, Gavin Saul had submitted a supplementary addendum to the Commission's study from the recording he'd made in the observation bay. I was told it was classified at the Accord's senior analyst level, which I found mildly interesting but not surprising. I never read it. I don't know exactly what he wrote, and I don't need to. He was a careful observer, and he asked the right question at the right moment, and whatever he wrote down was probably more accurate than most of what ends up in those reports. The thing that goes in those reports, usually, is the capability data, the numbers, the tactical outcomes, what humans did and how many of them did it and what the cost was. That information is real, and it's useful, and it belongs in reports. But the thing Sult was trying to write down was something else. He was trying to write down the reason behind the number, the thing that makes the number what it is. And the reason is a short sentence that doesn't look like much on paper, and wouldn't look like much to someone reading a report who hadn't been in that room when I said it, hadn't been watching Saul's face when he processed it, hadn't been the forward element standing in the doorway with something new and heavy working itself into the bones of his understanding of how this work goes. She was ours, we went. That's all it is. That's the whole of it. Down at the bottom, when you've taken away every layer of tactical framing and operational analysis and probability assessment, someone was ours. Art. And she was immersed on the edge of a corridor full of people who needed to stop being a problem. And we went through them, and we brought her out, and we made the window, and she walked out of the facility on her own 9 days later. The corridor is just the corridor. It is the only things standing between you and the person you're going back for. And so you deal with it, and then it's behind you, and you don't think about it again, because there's nothing useful left to think. If Saul's report says anything less than that, it's incomplete. If it says anything more, it's overcomplicating it. She was ours, we went.